Hello everyone, this video is going to be an extensive tutorial on how to make your very own UTAU Voicebank. If you're not familiar with my work and have just come across this video on its own, hi, hello. I'm a vocal synth cover artist who uses UTAU and SynthV, and I also voice and manage the Voicebank Yupphire. If you're curious, this is what their Voicebank sounds like. For those of you who don't know but clicked on this video anyways, UTAU is a program similar to Vocaloid where a virtual singer can sing whatever you want by typing in notes and lyrics. The main draw of UTAU specifically is that it allows you to download and use voice banks created by other users, and as I'm about to discuss in this video, create your own voice bank using samples of your own voice. The reason I'm making an UTAU voice bank tutorial now, despite the rise of other vocal synth softwares, is that a lot of the resources for UTAU voice bank creation are sort of scattered across the internet, and you need to do tons of Googling just to know what you're doing. So I'm making this video to make voice bank creation much more accessible and give people an idea of the general process. That, and I'm a bitch with a hyperfixation and plenty of free time on their hands. I'll also have a variety of different resources in the description that I recommend checking out if you're confused about a particular aspect of voice bank creation. There will also be certain pieces of software and different files that I'll mention, so each and every one of those will be in the description. So if nothing else, this video can also serve as a good hub for reliable resources. A few things of note that I want to clarify though. First, I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the UTAU software and that you know how to make USTs for the type of voice bank that you plan on making. For the sake of this video's flow, I'm not going to stop and define terms and vernacular and explain things that most UTAU users should already be familiar with. Second, I'm assuming that you are voicing this bank yourself or having someone voice it for you personally. I'm not going to teach you how to fish audio from cartoon shows to make a SpongeBob voice bank. You're on your own with that one. And lastly, I've only made Japanese VCV banks before, so any and all knowledge I provide regarding voice banks in different recording types or in other languages will be secondhand knowledge. I can't realistically teach you the specifics on how to make any possible voice bank type that is imaginable to man, but I hope at the very least I can show you the tools and how to use them to make your own voice bank. I'm going to try and format the information in this video as universally as possible so that the information can be applied to any voice bank type, even if I'm using Japanese VCV as my primary example. That being said, if you're a newcomer and this is your first voice bank, I strongly recommend that you make a Japanese voice bank first and don't touch other languages for right now. I don't care if it's CV or VCV, just as long as it's Japanese. Regardless of if you're familiar with the language or not, Japanese is by far the easiest language to make voice banks for because it's the language that UTAU was ultimately built for. English and other languages are a lot more advanced, a lot more involved, and a lot easier to fuck up if you don't know what you're doing. Also, this video will have subtitles for both accessibility reasons and to use as a crutch for my shitty enunciation. I really did try to speak clearly, guys, I promise, but it turns out I'm just kind of bad at speaking. But without further ado, let's get on to the tutorial. Voicebank Types. Before I actually get into voice bank creation, I'm going to quickly go over the different types of voice banks. You probably know about most of these and how they function from a user end, but I want to explain how they work on a technical level because it's not something that's explained particularly well, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Most UTAU voice banks will be recorded either in CV, VCV, CVVC, VCCV, or ARPACine. There are variations of these, but I'm only going to discuss these 5 because they are the most common. CV voice banks are by far the simplest and easiest voice bank to make because their samples are made up of single syllables. Because of this, CV voice banks often sound choppy and unnatural and have a stop and go feel because the syllables don't really flow into each other. VCV voice banks are made up of continuous samples that record multiple syllables in one recording. Ka ka ki ka ku ke ka me me mu mo me mo mo san sa sa si sa su sa. Since they are strings of syllables rather than single syllables, vowels can be cross-faded into each other before the consonants so that they flow into each other much more naturally. VCV voice banks are also considered more tricky to make because consistency between samples is much more important and there are significantly more aliases. Some people will recommend that your first ever Voicebank should be a CV because VCV is a lot more involved and easier to mess up, but I was a maniac who jumped straight into VCV and my Voicebank still turned out fine, so your mileage may vary.
遥か彼方つながり結びたいこの声から
CV-VC voicebanks are also made up of continuous samples, but unlike VCV voicebanks, they use overlap samples between notes.
Cha chi chu che cho cho.
The main draw to CV-VC is that its flexibility in how consonants are used can make it so that you can more easily make words that end in consonants, which makes it the standard for most non-Japanese languages. And for Japanese banks, it's still considered a good middle ground between CV and VCV because they generally use fewer recordings than VCV but still sound smoother than CV. There's also VCCV, which can basically be seen as a subcategory of CV-VC. They have a lot of structural similarities in the way they are recorded in Oto, but VCCV is often a lot more complicated because it accounts for things like consonant clusters and VC endings.
Uku, tre tre, ji ji kij.
But for all intents and purposes, VCCV is basically just CV-VC but extra. Lastly, Arpacene is a relatively new recording system used specifically for English, which also has a similar structure to CV-VC. This Voicebank type uses ARPAbit, which is an English phoneme system that characterizes each consonant and vowel with a specific code. You might recognize it if you're familiar with Synthesizer V or Chevio's English voicebanks. Arpacene Reckless will generally consist of various English words rather than specific sounds like an English VCCV.
Buzz, blonde, the spun, the what? Crave, stain, taste. I want to connect all the ends of the earth just with this voice of mine.
It's also worth noting that CV and VCV only really work with Japanese because of the phonetics of that language. People have made attempts at English CV and VCV banks, but they all sound really bad because the recording system just isn't very accommodating for anything as phonetically complex as English. If you want to make voice banks in other languages, VCCV is pretty much your only option. Next, you have monopitch versus multi-pitch banks. Monopitch voice banks are only recorded in one preset pitch. While they can still sound good, they potentially have a smaller vocal range than multi-pitch banks because when the notes are too much higher or lower than their original pitch, they will sound more distorted. Multi-pitch voice banks use multiple recorded pitches, and because of this, UTAU doesn't need to work as hard to make the voice sing lower and higher notes. Multi-pitch voice banks also have the potential to sound much more dynamic. In human vocals, lower and higher notes are sung in slightly different registers, so when you have multiple pre-recorded pitches, the voice bank will sound much more natural. Voicebanks will also sometimes include appends, which are pitches recorded in a different tone to accommodate different singing styles and genres. They can either be released as separate voicebanks or they can be included into one large voicebank so that the user can transition between different appends mid-song. The most common type of appends you'll see are power appends and soft appends, which are sung in a stronger tone and a breathier soft tone respectively. I don't particularly recommend that you make them for your first voicebank since I believe you should put more time and attention into your core voicebank, but nevertheless, appends can be a great way to expand a vocalist's versatility.
Do re mi fa sol la ti do. Do re mi fa sol la ti do. Do re mi fa sol la ti do.
And now that we have that out of the way, we can move on to actually making the voice bank.
3. Preconditions and planning.
Before you start making your voice bank, there are first some very important pieces of software that you need to download first. The first is Oto-ing, which was created specifically for making UTAU Voicebank. It will not only automatically save all of your samples under specific aliases, but it'll also help you record samples on a tempo, which will make Oto-ing your voicebank significantly easier. You'll also want to download SetParam, which is my program of choice for Oto-ing. You can also Oto in UTAU itself, but I find SetParam to be much easier to use and it has some features which are very useful, such as adding suffixes for multi-pitch and append banks. People might tell you that these programs aren't necessary, and they're not completely incorrect. But considering the alternative is going into Audacity, recording along a background tempo guide that you don't have, and encoding and saving everything manually, there isn't really a single situation in which I would tell you to not use Otomo. Because Otomo only comes with one guide BGM, I also recommend downloading more of them in different pitches. A BGM is basically the metronome audio that's played in the background when you record samples, and it's extremely helpful, especially if you're recording continuous samples. You first need to figure out how you want your voice bank to be designed in a technical sense. Pitch count, appends, and features aren't something that you need to decide on right away, but knowing what recording type you want to make your voice bank in is extremely important because it will be the foundation on which your voice bank is built on a technical level. You'll also want to download a good rec list for the specific recording type you want to use. A rec list is a list of syllables to be recorded, and it's meant to contain all of the phonetic data required for the voice bank to function, and they are all very different depending on which recording type you're using. To figure out what pitches to record in, I strongly recommend first finding out your vocal range, because that'll tell you very clearly the limits of your voice and what pitches would be practical to record. Make sure you don't include pitches that you have to strain your voice to hit. After that, I'd recommend recording your first pitch in a pitch that's comfortable and natural for you, but on the lower middle end of the range that you want the voice bank to have, because generally speaking, UTAU samples will synthesize better with higher notes than lower notes. If you're making a mono-pitch voice bank, you can just leave it at that. But for a multi-pitch bank, it'll be a helpful starting point where you can feel out which pitches you need to add. You can test out that single pitch in UTAU and plug it into some USTs and listen to how lower and higher notes sound, and take note of which range it sounds best in. UTAU does give an estimated range for each voice bank, but it's not particularly accurate. Just trust your ears for this part. In terms of how many pitches apart each recorded pitch should be, there's not really a hard set rule. I recorded Yupphire V2 in C4, F4, and A sharp 4, which are all 5 pitches apart from each other, so that I could get as much of a vocal range from them as I could. I generally recommend having about 3 to 6 pitches between each recorded pitch. Too many and the in-between pitches will sound weirdly distorted, and too few means you're wasting time and energy recording a pitch that won't really make your voice bank sound all that different. The only situation in which I'd recommend recording pitches that are really close to each other is if you want one pitch to have significantly more or less power. For example, if you record pitches B4 and C5, and C5 is a falsetto, because in this case it's less about vocal range and more about dynamics and versatility. I also don't recommend recording more than 6 pitches, assuming you're not making appends. If you record more than that, you get a diminishing return, and worst case scenario, your voice bank will start to become more muddled. Multi-pitch is meant to act as an extension of the voice bank's range and dynamics, so more is less in this case. Newer voice banks will also include a variety of different extras and add-ons. These features aren't essential and they're quite situational and practical usage. These include breaths, glottal subs, end breaths, natural ends, vocal fry, and more. Keep in mind that if you want these in your voice bank, you'll have to include them in your rec list, since most rec lists won't come with them by default. However, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent for the conclusion part of this segment. I want to clarify that your voice bank can absolutely be a monopitch without any extras and still be a good quality voice bank. With UTAU voice bank creation getting easier over time and with more resources becoming available, voice banks have been getting bigger with the amount of pitches, appends, and extras they contain. Which is definitely a good thing, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to imply that people pushing the boundaries of what UTAU can do is a bad thing, but it's had the side effect of making newcomers think that their voice bank needs to be a 14-pitch multi-expression voice bank to meet baseline standards of quality, which just isn't true. Some of the most popular and well-known voice banks are monopitch. Even if you ignore her appends and just look at her VCV by itself, Kasane Teto is still a damn good voice bank, and it's still widely used to this day. So, in conclusion, not every voice bank needs to have edge samples if you don't wanna.
4. Japanese pronunciation.
For this section, I want to briefly go over Japanese pronunciation because it's something that many non-Japanese speakers struggle with in voice bank creation. Given that Japanese is by far the most popular language for a voice bank, it's likely that this section will be of use to you. For anyone who's apprehensive about making a Japanese voice bank because they're not a Japanese speaker, I'm gonna reassure you and say that Japanese is one of the most phonetically simple languages, even for English speakers. Japanese operates on a system of many consonant-vowel pairs along with 5 singular vowels and 1 single consonant, which is n. And luckily for the average English speaker, every consonant that exists in Japanese has a rough English equivalent. The only arguable exception to this is the Japanese R, which sounds more like a blend of English R and L. There's also tsu, which some English speakers may have trouble distinguishing from su, but the T and S combo still exists in many English words, even if they're usually the last phonemes of a word instead of the first. English has words like rabbits and bolts that have the T and S combo, and when you try and pronounce it as if there were no T, you'll immediately hear the difference. Like, you don't say carrots, you say carrots. When pronouncing the T sound, your tongue is going to be touching the roof of your mouth, so keep that in mind. It's also worth noting that Japanese speakers will aspirate certain syllables much less than an English speaker would. Most notably, T sounds, K sounds, and P sounds. These sounds will generally be a lot softer and have a lot less emphasis in Japanese than in English, so there's less of an emphasis on the consonants. So if your rec list says the following and you say ta, ta, ti, ta, tu, te, ta, try saying something more like ta, ta, ti, ta, tu, te, ta. That being said, I'm not a native Japanese speaker, so take the nuances in my pronunciation with a grain of salt. This part is less about pronunciation and more about the differences between these following characters. This is just your basic O vowel, and this is a diphthong pronounced as wo. But this character is a little bit different. Despite it often being romanized as wo, it's usually just pronounced o, so if you choose to include this character in your voice bank, pronounce it the same as o. If all of this sounds a bit overwhelming and you don't think you're ready to record just yet, feel free to practice. Try saying some simple Japanese phrases or reading your rec list a few times, and when in doubt, study the way native Japanese speakers pronounce things and pay attention to the nuances in their speech, and try and replicate their pronunciation. However, as long as you're pronouncing things mostly correctly, you shouldn't worry about accents too much. Not just because a non-Japanese accent is inevitable by virtue of you not being a Japanese speaker, but because trying to force an accent is probably going to end up biting you in the ass later. If you try and force an accent, it'll probably end up sounding less natural and less consistent. Even if you aspirate your T's more than a native Japanese speaker would, it's still better than them being so underpronounced that they sound like D's. Just make sure you don't botch anything too terribly and your voice bank will probably sound fine in the end.
5. Recording.
Your recording setup is going to be very important because the audio quality of your samples is going to be a huge factor in the quality of your voice bank. For your microphone, you'll want something that's at least halfway decent. I used the Blue Snowball mic for UV2, which I paid about 40 USD for. There are absolutely better mics out there, but considering the scale of my projects and the fact that I'm a cheapskate, I wasn't willing to part with a fortune just to make my stupid singing anime child, and frankly, you shouldn't either. Still, if your mic makes you sound like a muffled mess that's drowning underwater, you might want to consider getting something that sounds a little less like that. You also want to record in a quiet space where you can sing loudly as much as you want, and you want to record in a room that has little echo. A good place to record that you probably have access to is a closet or under your desk. You can also surround yourself with pillows if you want. You also want to be close to the mic, but not so close that all of your samples are peaking. Your mic might give you specific recommendations as to how close you should be to it, and you might be able to change the mic sensitivity. To make sure your voice can sound as good as it can, you first want some water on you so that your throat doesn't get too sore and that your voice can remain consistent. You also might want to get rid of any phlegm or mucus in your throat because that will make your voice less consistent and more scratchy. Generally speaking, a lot of sugary foods will do this, so be aware of that. A personal piece of advice that I have that I'm surprised I've heard absolutely no one mention is that when you're recording, especially your higher pitches, I strongly recommend doing at least some sort of vocal warm-up before you record. It doesn't have to be a lengthy one, it can just be a quick 5 or 10 minutes. Just something to warm up your voice so that you don't fucking die trying to belt out a D5 power pitch. But if you feel that a particular pitch is too straining or too difficult, don't be afraid to lower it to something more manageable. Like I said, UTAU is actually pretty good at synthesizing the higher notes, especially when compared to lower notes, so it really isn't worth straining your voice to do something that UTAU already does pretty well on its own. The main takeaway I want to drill into everyone's heads is that consistency is absolutely paramount. All of your samples should sound as similar to each other in tone and pronunciation as humanly possible. This is especially important for voice banks that use continuous samples, because if the syllables don't blend together properly, it's going to be incredibly jarring and unpleasant to listen to. Whereas at least in CV, everything sounds separated from each other by default as a result of the voice bank infrastructure. I also want to touch on voice acting in voice banks. When you record a voice bank, a lot of people will just record it in their regular singing voice, but if you want a specific voice type, you can voice act in order to make it sound a certain way. For example, my Voicebank U is very voice acted, which you can very quickly figure out by listening to my narration and comparing it to their singing. I recorded their Voicebank in my highest register to make them sound more childlike, and while it's potentially a bit ear-grating, especially if you're not accustomed to high-pitched anime voice, it's a tone that not a lot of voice banks have and it helps them stand out. However, the main difficulty with voice acting your voice banks is that it's a lot harder to make your samples consistent with each other in tone. So if you do decide to voice act your voice bank, make sure that you're using a voice that is sustainable for multiple long recording sessions. I also strongly recommend that you have a vocal reference, whether it's a previous recording of yours, someone else's voice that you're trying to mimic, or both. Like, when I was recording news samples for their V2, I noticed that my voice started to sort of drift off as I was recording, and the samples that I had just recorded ended up sounding different from the first samples that I recorded during the session, so I ended up having to re-record a bunch of samples just to make sure that they all sounded consistent. So don't do what I did. Don't forget to actually listen to your recordings and compare them with each other. It'll save you a lot of time in the long run. On the technical side of things, you'll first need to open up Oto-ing, go into File, and then click Load Voice List. This will allow you to put in the rec list that you plan on recording. Occasionally, a rec list you download might also come with a comment file, which if you're recording a Japanese bank will make it much easier to know what sounds to make if you can't read hiragana. You'll need to go into File and then Load Comment File. If you don't have a comment file, you can also just type in the comments yourself in the program. Note that if you have a hiragana rec list that doesn't come with a romaji version or a comment file, Google Translate will not save you. Google Translate will do a lot of weird things with certain characters and you'll be stuck with a jumbled mess of letters and a bunch of headaches. So if you can't read hiragana and you absolutely need romaji, find a rec list that comes with it by default. You'll also need to set up the recording style settings, so go into Options, Recording Style Settings. From here, you can configure it according to preference, but I usually just use Automatic Recording 1 because it's much easier to record one sample at a time and listen back to my recordings. Here you can also change the BGM. By default, Oto-ing will save all of your recordings to the result folder, so if you want to change it, you'll need to go into File, Set Recording folder. This is also where I should note that if you're making a voice bank with multiple pitches or appends, each one will need its own dedicated folder and you should treat them like their own separate banks for now. Each pitch and append will have its own Oto file and you really don't want to mix it up with samples from other pitches. From this point you can actually start recording your samples. When you press record, sing the syllables on screen to the beat of the guide at a consistent pitch throughout. If you're using a rec list with single syllables, make sure that you hold the note for a good amount of time, and if you're recording continuous samples, don't pause between syllables. You want them to flow naturally as if you're talking or singing. Oto-ing can also show the power and pitch of your recording so that you know if your recording is consistent or not. So once you're done recording all of your pitches, we can finally get on to everyone's favorite part.
Oto-ing.
For those who don't know, Oto-ing is what we call the process of making the oto.ini file, which is a configuration file that tells UTAU in what way to use the recordings and to make sure that the recordings are going to be used at the right timings and the right placements. It's also kind of very difficult to teach because the way you Oto is going to heavily depend on the recording type you use, but I'll try my best to explain how to Oto your various Voicebank types, along with some general tips and tricks that can apply to all Voicebank types. In an Oto, there are 6 different values. The first one is the alias, which is just what the note is called. Depending on the recording type used, it can be called different things. Then you have your left blank or offset, overlap, pre-utterance, consonant, and right blank or cutoff. The left blank is measured in milliseconds from the start of the recording, and the rest of the values are measured in milliseconds from the left blank. However, for the cutoff, if the value is a positive number, it's measured in milliseconds from the end of a recording, but if it's a negative number, it's measured in milliseconds from the left blank like everything else. Everything between the left blank and the overlap line will be crossfaded with the previous recording, and everything between the consonant line and the right blank will be crossfaded into the next note. Everything between the overlap and the pre-utterance will not be affected by the crossfade. The pre-utterance is where the note starts, and everything between the pre-utterance and the right blank is the bulk of the note. The consonant tells UTAU what not to loop, and usually highlights everything from the left blank to maybe a little after the pre-utterance. This is so that UTAU doesn't play the K sound multiple times when you use a ka note, and ensures that the most stable portion of the note's vowel is either looped or stretched instead, depending on your resampler. This is the case regardless of the note length. We'll first need to get a base Oto for our voice bank. Note that this is a base Oto, so this is more meant to give you a template to work with and certainly not a finished product. Releasing your voice bank with an unmodified pre-generated Oto is like making a cover without mixing it. It's going to sound like shit, so don't do that. If you're making a VCV or CV bank with hiragana file names, you can use setparam to automatically generate a base Oto. For CVs, you'll be presented with a bunch of settings which will seem intimidating, but you don't really have to touch these because you'll be changing a lot of the values anyways. Just use the default settings and generate the Oto. For VCVs, you'll have to input the tempo length, which is just the BPM of the guide BGM you use when recording, and the start position of your recordings, which is how much time there is between when you start recording and when you start speaking. After you've done that, you can initialize each parameter value and you can generate the Oto. Please note that in VCV lists that use the bullet point for glottal stops, you'll have to fix the aliasing in setparam or in the Oto itself, since you can edit it like a notepad file. But otherwise, you'll be free of any and all aliasing issues. Do not select a suffix at this stage. If you use Romaji file names, you'll have to use More Sampler. Congratulations, we're in hell now. Drag and drop the folder onto More Sampler. Select the rec list type that you wish to use. In all honesty, it's recommended to Oto CV completely by hand rather than using a More Sampler base. More Sampler is genuinely horrible and should only be used in situations like VCV, where generating hundreds of Oto entries by hand would be impractical. Next, select hiragana when it asks for the aliasing option. Romaji VCV is incredibly rare and much harder to use due to incompatibility with plugins, and no sane human uses the phonemes option. Do not append a suffix at this stage. Now, regardless of whether you generated your base files with More Sampler or setparam, open up the Oto in setparam and look through it to fix any aliasing issues. If you use setparam, you should only see these on any file named in Romaji, glottal stops that use bullet points, vocal fries, or just anything that uses characters outside of any Japanese scripts, but it's fairly good at aliasing everything correctly. More Sampler, on the other hand, frequently messes up aliases, and if you're wondering why, here's how. Once you're sure you've cleared your Oto of aliasing issues, regardless of which program generated the base, download number duplicate aliases. Run it, select your operating system, and when it asks for the number of duplicates you want, enter 0. You'll now see a new file created called edited-oto.ini, which will have about 10 to 20% less lines than before due to it deleting anything that was redundant. Rename this file to oto.ini and allow it to overwrite your old file. Open it up in setparam and now navigate to Tools, Change Aliases, and enter %a followed by your suffix in the text box if you're planning to suffix your Otos for the purposes such as multi-pitching. If not, then there's no need to go into the Change Aliases menu. Now you should have everything set up for the VCV Oto. If you got your VCV base using More Sampler, there's one more step that's not mandatory but recommended. There's this program out there called Oto Adjuster. Open your Otoit and open up setparam's Auto Oto feature, enter your BPM data, let it calculate the base values based on that. Do not generate a new Oto. Write the number setparam calculates for the overlap, pre-utterance, consonant, and right blank done in Oto Adjuster, rounded to whole numbers. Hit the Adjust My Oto/OK button. Congrats, now you have a usable More Sampler base. If you're making an ARPA bank, you can use More Sampler instead to generate a base Oto. If you're making an English VCCV bank, the list comes with a pre-made base Oto and a BGM to use while recording, along with an Oto tutorial posted by the list creator. The base Oto isn't perfect obviously, but it'll get you most of the way there, needing only minor adjustments. This is also the case with most custom non-Japanese rec lists. ARPA is the outlier here. Do not use More Sampler for custom rec lists that are not Japanese and not ARPA, and always be 100% sure to read the rec list documentation on Oto-ing if it's available. So because of this, I'm not going to teach you how to Oto different languages such as Chinese, French, Korean, or whatever. Not only because I don't have experience with Oto-ing these languages and covering them would nearly double the length of this video, but because whatever documentation the rec list comes with will almost always be the best possible resource for Oto-ing. This also goes for English Oto-ing methods. I've told you how to get VCCV English and ARPA based Otos, but for the rest of the process process, I'm going to direct you to other resources. You absolutely do not want me to attempt to bastardize this information, especially since it's already there for you. VCCV English already has an official English tutorial for everything from recording to Oto-ing, and I recommend watching that guidance as it's very clear. As for ARPAcing, there aren't any official Oto-ing tutorials, but there are still some reliable resources that you can use from people who actually know what they're talking about, aka not me. Now, if you're making Japanese voice banks and you're still with me, we can move ahead to the bit you were probably waiting for. When you're Oto-ing in SetParam, you first want to turn on a few settings. First, always have the spectrogram open. It's a visual representation of the audio and can really help distinguish between consonants and vowels. The pitch and loudness monitor can also be useful for determining what the most stable part of a syllable is. In CV Otos, the left blank starts immediately when the sounds start, and the right blank should cut off the vowel before it loses consistency and fades off. The pre-utterant should be right between the consonant and the vowel, and the consonant line should be placed so that between the consonant and the left blank is the most consistent portion of the vowel. Where the overlap should go depends on what type of consonant the sample has. A general rule of thumb is that your hard consonants like your T's, P's, and K's will sound best if the overlap is a few milliseconds before the consonant waveform. Soft consonants like M's and N's will generally sound better if the overlap parameter is in the middle of the waveform and when the left blank is at the start of the consonant waveform, because these consonants are more continuous. Semi-hard consonants like B's, G's, and D's will sound best if you Oto them similarly to soft consonants but with the smaller gap between the left blank and overlap parameter. If you're making a VCV Oto, go into Options, Mouse key settings. When the left blank is modified, other parameters are modified accordingly to keep relative positions. This way you'll be able to move the entire configuration altogether rather than needing to move everything independently. Ensure that utterance timing adjustment mode is on as well, as it's ensured that when you move the pre-utterance, everything moves with it. Unlike with CV Otos, you really only need to modify where the entire configuration is rather than the different values independently, assuming you're using SetParam's generated Oto. So my general technique is to keep all of those settings but change the pre-utterance line so that it's right between the consonant and the vowel. If I'm Otoing a line that's just vowels, I put the pre-utterance line between the two vowels. It's actually kind of tricky to distinguish between different vowels, but looking at the spectrum makes it a bit easier. In cases of glides like kyo, treat the Y as if it's part of the vowel. And also make sure that the overlap is right at the end of the final stable part of the first vowel. In Japanese CV/VC Otos, there are two different types of Otos within the voice bank. You have CVs and VCs, both require different types of configurations. The CVs are very similar to that of CV only banks, but if you're Otoing a syllable that has a vowel before it, then make sure that the left blank is just at the end of the previous vowel. For VCs, the pre-utterance should be at the end of the vowel. Where you put the consonant and right blank depends on the specific consonant. For hard consonants such as your K's and your T's, you'll notice there's a bit of silence between them and the previous vowel. These will be cut out completely, so the consonant and the right blank should contain all of that silence. Soft consonants such as N's and M's won't have this silence though, so between the consonant and the right blank will be the bulk of the consonant. You'll also have your S's and Z's. These will not have any silence, but they carry no pitch, so looping them sounds absolutely terrible. The solution is to have an area between the consonant and the right blank contain the final 5 to 10 milliseconds of the consonant, or the first 5 to 10 milliseconds of the following vowel. Because of how CVVC gets handled when crossfading, you'll never hear that weird looping part. Please ensure that the right blank and consonant are not touching, however, because if they are, UTAU will crash when trying to render that note, so don't do that. And with that, you've completed one of the most tedious steps of the voice bank making process. Oto-ing is pretty difficult for most people to understand, especially if you're making a non-Japanese voice bank, so if you're still confused about all of this, I have some resources in the description for further reading. But if you're done with this step, we can get on to finalizing your voice bank. Now that you're done with your recordings and your Oto, there are still some files that you need in order for your voice bank to be truly complete. The first one is a character.txt file, which just tells UTAU some important information about the voice bank. They're formatted as such, but you can leave out certain lines or have them in a different order. The first four are the voice bank name, voice bank author, the voice bank's website, and the version name or number, which are all pretty self-explanatory. The sample can be a short .wav file that demos what the voice bank sounds like. It's what you hear when you go into UTAU Voicebank properties and click sample. If you omit this part, UTAU will just randomly select any .wav file within the voice bank, which will probably just be one of your raw samples. A quick aside here, but if you do make a custom sample, make sure that it's something sweet and simple, like a short melody line, solfege, or Talkloid bit. Please don't make it over 15 seconds, because there is no way to pause or stop it without closing the entire program. The image line will tell UTAU which image file within the Voicebank to use for its profile image. Note that it must be a 24-bit BMP or JPEG that is exactly 100 by 100 pixels, or else UTAU won't recognize it. Most Voicebanks will also include a README file, which can have information about the Voicebank, details about the Voicebank character, terms of use, ways to contact the person who made the Voicebank, and whatever else you feel is necessary to tell the user. The content in README files will also be displayed under the Voicebank properties. Next, you'll need to generate FRQ files for every sample. This step isn't technically necessary, as users can automatically generate their own just by using the Voicebank, but it's a huge time saver for the user, and I just generally recommend that you do it. You might have already generated some if you were testing your Voicebank, because they're generated when you first render anything that uses that particular sample. FRQ files are small files for each sample that tells UTAU what pitch the sample is recorded at, so that the program can more effectively pitch shift the note to other pitches. If you want to generate all FRQ files, go into UTAU and into voice configurations. Select every note and click initialize frequency map. It'll take quite a while depending on how many samples you have. If you tell UTAU to generate a bunch of FRQ files and it looks like it's frozen, don't panic. It's still generating the files, it just takes a while depending on which resampler you're using. Another quick aside, because this was an issue that came up quite a bit when making both of my Voicebanks, if you're ever testing a Voicebank and one of the samples for no explicable reason sounds super weird, as if there's a bunch of blips and it sounds like they're gargling, that's due to issues with the FRQ files. In order to fix it, you can use UTAU itself, but I prefer the interface of an FRQ editor, which I've linked in the description. Once you've found the offending note, look at the pitch. The pitch will naturally fluctuate on the constant, but if the pitch looks super out of whack, you need to straighten it out. If you're using the FRQ editor, you can just draw the correct frequencies, save it, and that should fix it. If you're making a multi-pitch bank, you'll need to create a file called a prefix map, which basically tells UTAU which recordings to use for what pitches the note is sung in. You can actually just do this in the UTAU program itself. Load your Voicebank into UTAU, then go into Tools, Edit Prefix Map. From here, you can assign the pitches you've recorded to what UTAU should use to render in a specific pitch. The standard seems to be using your lowest note for every note up until you reach your next highest note, but your mileage may vary, so experiment. Users can also change the prefix maps themselves with relative ease, so don't feel too anxious about making it perfect. With appends, the user will have to add a suffix to each and every single note, and with multi-pitch appends, people will have to type in the pitch and the append suffix unless they're using OpenUTAU and make a subbank. If you don't use OpenUTAU, feel free to skip the rest of this section, but I want to quickly go over subbanks. Since OpenUTAU is very epic and very poggers, it has a feature that allows users to easily switch between appends on a note-by-note basis. All subbank information is stored in a character.yaml file. In order to make a subbank, go into OpenUTAU, go into the Singers tab, and find your Voicebank. Click Edit Subbank and click Add Color. This color will just be the name of your append. From here, you can edit it like a prefix map just for that particular append. Doing this isn't necessary, and most Voicebanks don't even do this considering how new OpenUTAU is, but I just want to normalize including subbank settings because it's just a really good feature and it's a huge time saver. So every time I download a Voicebank that already has configured subbanks, a little part of me on the inside does a little happy dance. The only reason this section is near the end is because it doesn't really fit in with the other sections in a chronological sense, but this part can absolutely be done before, during, or after the Voicebank is actually made. One thing that newcomers might not realize is that you don't actually need a character or a personality to go along with a Voicebank, but it's been the standard for good reason. After all, Hatsune Miku's popularity is largely due to her having a really strong character design. Associating your Voicebank with a character will make them significantly easier to remember and also serve as a way to further personalize your Voicebank and give it a sense of its own identity. A lot of people might give their UTAUloid a canon personality, backstory, and general lore, but if you choose to do this for your character, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to force others to abide by these traits at all times and in all situations. In fact, most people who give their UTAUloid lore will still allow users to disregard it if it prevents them from using their Voicebank in creative ways or for certain songs. And others might just give their UTAUloid a character design and let them be a completely blank slate. For you, Fujimura, I just just gave a vibe, a highly generic backstory, and left it at that. Because while I see them as a singing happy dancy baby with no thoughts behind their adorable sparkly eyes, others might interpret them differently, and I don't want to necessarily discourage that. In terms of actually designing a character, there's not really one way to go about doing it. Sure, there are character design attributes that will signal towards the virtual singer archetype, but that's definitely not an absolute must. So your Italoid doesn't have to look like a Kryptonoid. For the most part, your Italoid can just look like anything, even if it's just a JPEG of a toaster. So the main takeaway is that whatever preconceived notions you have about what a vocal synth character or an Italoid has to look like are mere suggestions rather than rules.
9. Distribution.
Distribution is purely optional, and while many people will want to share their voice banks for others to use, it's by no means necessary. You're totally allowed to have a private voice bank, so feel free to skip this section if this is irrelevant to you. But for those of you who do want to distribute it and want other people to use it, I first recommend making a page for them on UTAU.wiki. UTAU.wiki is one of the best non-Japanese resources for UTAU, and it also serves as a pretty reliable place to find information about specific voice banks. You can also use UTAU's fandom wiki, but it's not as reliable as a source and it doesn't have as much information, so people are generally less likely to use it. However, due to recent technical issues with UTAU.wiki, such as a non-functional search or occasionally lapsing domain registration, it's generally recommended to have pages on both wikis in the likely event UTAU.wiki experiences technical issues for a few hours. In terms of hosting the download for the voice bank itself, you can use services such as Google Drive, Mediafire, or Dropbox. I also generally recommend that you give your voice bank their own dedicated website, preferably through a service like Wix or Card. This way you can not only host voicebank download links and give information about the voicebank, but you can also have a place for artwork you have for the voicebank, their terms of use, and general information. You can include this in a README file in your voicebank, but having a website means people will have easier access to up-to-date information in case you want to change anything post-download. Speaking of which, I recommend having a terms of use for your voicebank so that you can clarify what you do and do not want your voicebank being used for. For example, you can clarify if you want your voicebank or character to be used in sexual and violent content, to what extent you allow commercial usage of your voicebank, or how much modification of the original voicebank files you want to permit. I've heard some people claim that a terms of use page will provide some legal protection, which I am absolutely not qualified to confirm or deny, but it can at the very least allow good faith users to know what they can and can't do with your voicebank. Lastly, when releasing a voicebank for the first time, it's customary to create some sort of demo, whether that be a full cover or a demo reel consisting of a bunch of shorter covers made by different users. I recommend you upload it on YouTube. SoundCloud also works, but YouTube is a lot better for just promotion in general. If you release a voicebank but don't actually use it or make anything with it, no one is going to want to download it, so use this as an opportunity to show the full extent of your voicebank and what it can do. If you made appends, find a song that you can cover where you can utilize them. If you made extras, try and find ways to organically integrate them into your demo. And even if you just have a mono pitch bank, some good tuning and mixing can still go a long way.
10. Yupphire.
And if you followed all of the steps in this tutorial, then congratulations! You've made your very own UTAU voice bank. I really hope this video helped in any way whatsoever and made things a little bit more digestible and easy to grasp. For this outro, I want to quickly give some shoutouts to people who have in one way or another helped me with this video. First, I'd like to thank my friend Lepton, who allowed me to use some of his art for the backgrounds of a couple of the segments. He doesn't do anything vocal synth related as of now, but if you like a lot of rustic and steampunk-esque illustrations and Magnus Archive stuff, then please check out his work because he is the absolute best. I'd also like to thank General Nuisance for helping me tremendously with the Oto-ing section of this video, because if it weren't for her, the Oto section would be all sorts of bad and wrong. Honestly, to give credit where credit is due, roughly half the Oto segment is just written by her, so definitely go check out her work. And I'd like to thank Kira for also helping me edit the script. And I want to give a special thanks to all of the following creators for allowing me to use their voicebank samples in this video. All of the links to these creators will be in the description, so go check them out, tell them I said hi. And lastly, thank you for watching this video. This is a serious departure from anything I've ever made before, so it means a lot to me that you stuck with me to the end. I don't know if I'll make this sort of content again, but if you like UTAU and Synth Me covers, please check out the rest of my channel and perhaps even subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. If you're looking for more UTAU voice banks to download, please check out my vocalist fabulous, you Fujimura. They are my baby, and I would absolutely love to see more people use them. If you still have questions regarding Voicebank creation, I'll be checking the comments and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. You can also join my Discord server if you'd like, and I'll be willing to answer your UTAU questions there. My server isn't specifically for vocal sense stuff, but it was made with all kinds of artists in mind, so feel free to check it out. You can also follow me on Twitter and Tumblr, all links in the description. And with that, I'll see you guys later. Bye bye!